Sometimes when you're driving down the road all by yourself, you begin to hear a voice that tells you need to look around, pay attention. Maybe something isn't quite right. That voice is me. It's the voice of Gord. Hello everyone, welcome back to Voice of Gord. Happy summer, August 16th. We're nearing the end of it. We won't hit that fast forward button. We'll try and enjoy the rest of it while we can, shall we? Today's show is going to be a very lengthy discussion on energy, electricity, the grid, how we get our power, what to do about all this hype about electric cars and electric trucks, where are we getting the resources for it all. Maybe we should use nuclear power. My guest is Mr. Emmet Penney, an energy analyst, philosopher, writer, and all-around interesting guy. We go hard for about 90 minutes. As you say, it's an energy-dense conversation. Pack a lunch, hold on tight. You're going to want to take some notes for this one. While we're here, just wanted to say thanks again to everybody for listening. My little show, my little experiment is doing all right. I'm approaching 600 subscribers on my Substack. Got a few people kicking me some money there for my writings, which is awesome. But as you know, this show remains free. The only thing that I ask of my audience is that y'all help me spread it around. You are my marketing department. I use word of mouth. I really don't advertise in any other way. If you know some truckers, please tell them about it. Pass it along. This is for you guys to sit and listen to while you're driving around. Or maybe if you're not even a trucker, maybe you're an Uber driver. I've had a professional black cab guy on as one of my guests. I'm going to be having a sort of freelance Uber driver and delivery guy from Los Angeles on soon. And, you know, if you're out there driving around or you got lots of time to listen, this show is for you. And the more we can spread it around, the more I can count on you guys to do that for me, the better. And I thank you in advance. Other work and news, a little later this week I should be having another article coming out at Compact Magazine talking about automated vehicles and the philosopher Matthew Crawford. Speaking of Matthew Crawford, I should be recording with him a little later this month and getting that episode out the door ASAP in September. I have a bunch more episodes lined up waiting to edit. It's been an embarrassment of riches. The only thing I am not rich in is time with which to edit them and push them out the door. I want to appreciate your guys' patience. I'm doing this from my basement and doing what I can. Got a couple of kids. I've apologized so many times now and I should probably stop doing that. Y'all are getting annoyed. While we're here, give a little shout out to my friends down under on the Australian On The Road Radio Network. I know I've got a few listeners down there. G'day mates, wherever you happen to be it the Nullarbor Highway heading west towards Perth, or maybe you're up on the Bruce, maybe you're scooting up the guts of it on the Stewart Highway heading up to Darwin, wherever you are. Hope you're well. Hope those three wagons behind you aren't wiggling around too much. G'day to Mike and Yogi. I know I'm supposed to get Yogi on the show here one of these days. I'm working on that. I'm going to get to it as soon as I can. All right, everybody. Let's get to Mr. Emmet Penney, the nuclear barbarian. G'day, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Voice of Gord. I'm Gord. This is my voice. The other voice you're going to hear today is that of a very interesting fellow I've been following for quite a while. He's an energy analyst and just podcaster, writer, intellectual in his own right, philosopher. But today we're going to talk about electrification, specifically for trucks and cars, and all of the details involved in that. And please welcome to the show the other voice you're going to hear, Mr. Emmet Penney.
Hey, good to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. No, I've been looking forward to this one. So you've done a lot of things. So you have your own podcast and Substack called Nuclear Barbarians.
That's right.
And then another podcast called Exhaust, where you like wax philosophically about many deep matters.
Well, that one actually ended. We had to end that. God, was it early this year, early last? I don't know. Time is such a blur. But yeah, so that one ran for like almost 2 years, I want to say. And then we had to shut it down, sadly. But yes, that one was about why nothing feels possible.
Right. Yeah. And you're also behind an energy newsletter called Grid Brief
That's right.
in partnership with a few folks.
Yeah, I have guys that handle all the advertising stuff. Like we keep editorial and advertising basically a separate world, so that way we're never passing off ad copy as news or
I've
vice
never
versa.
I don't think I've ever seen an ad on one of your emails.
Yeah, so we run them. We actually just started rolling them out fairly recently. So we're hoping to get more. We've opened it up to sponsors and stuff like that. But yeah, that's what my business partners handle. I am the content guy.
Right, right. And a content machine. You've written several articles for American Affairs Journal,
Hmm.
and a few other locations doing real deep dives on the history of the electrical grid and your very pugnacious support for a return to nuclear energy.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yes. So,
I live fairly close to a nuclear power plant in Oswego, New York.
oh,
Uh
you're upstate, right?
yeah, right on Lake Ontario. I live near Ithaca, and I remember
Hmm.
so I just was recently canceled from my third Twitter account. And on my first one is when I first bumped into you, and I think I was doing some posting about like this old make of truck called Brockway, whose factory was in Cortland, and you chimed in
Hmm.
on Cortland and lived there for a while. What's your history with Cortland, and why were you there?
Oh, so I had never lived there, but I have lived in upstate New York. I lived there during college for a little bit. I lived in White Creek, right near the Vermont border. And I'm like vaguely familiar with sort of the Cortland area and where it's from. I stumbled on the Brockway truck story in an out of print book on deindustrialization by two guys, Bennett and Bluestone. I think it's just called The Deindustrialization of America. And they told this heartbreaking story of what happened when the Brockway plant closed. There was also a Montgomery ward in the downtown area there. And once the plant closed, of course, that closed. And the town became so depopulated that a bumper sticker became common in Cortland that said, "The last person to leave Cortland shut out the lights."
Wow. Yeah, it's sort of there's a lot of like weird, are you're familiar with the term hauntology? Its
Hmm.
most recent big prognosticator was the late Mark Fisher,
Hmm.
the sort of UK based sort of weirdo lefty music critic philosopher guy.
Yeah.
Um, and and hauntology has other proponents and other applications, but it's sort of like specters of the past that haunt the present and then reflect into the future and then come backwards, and they you can see it in various things, and you sort of see like Cortland's kind of part of the Rust Belt, the sort of Rust Belt like extended into upstate New York. The old Kodak plant in Rochester,
Hmm.
steel plants around Buffalo. There was all kinds of manufacturing all across upstate New York. Most of it gone, and upstate New York has many of the sort of social and economic ills that affected other parts of Appalachia and the Rust Belt. And you see a little bit of that in Cortland. Like there's this weird dynamic where I used to drive through Cortland all the time because there's a hardwood mill there called the Gutchess
Hmm.
Lumber, and I used to bring logs to them. And you go through Cortland, and like there's the State University of New York Cortland campus, and sort of all the SUNY people, and then um, you'd see folks that sort of you're not sure if they were going to make it.
Hmm.
Maybe had a rough night or a rough week or a rough life in general, just kind of wandering around town.
Yeah, that sounds sadly right for a lot of places that got hit really hard once we started to move either factories offshore or to the or just down south. That's where a lot of that stuff went to.
Right. Yeah. And, yeah, and a lot of the automotive manufacturers are also now in South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee,
Hmm.
taking advantage of less stringent support for unions among state governments down there.
That's right. Yeah, that's how the Sun Belt was built.
Right. And does energy come into that? Like all these factories down there need a lot of electricity and power. Where does your project fit into like manufacturing and its power requirements?
Yeah, so I've actually sort of been working on a little piece on that for American Compass this week. So I've been doing a little bit of thinking about it. I don't know exactly what the relationship is between like um, let's say northern energy prices and like what's available down south. Mostly because when a lot of that stuff was happening, I think it was pretty uniform still. Most of the country was still in what we would call like regulated monopoly utility areas, which just means you have a utility you pay your bills to. It's their fiefdom. They control, the power plants, the poles and the wires that get it to you, and stuff like that.
Kind of like
And
NICEAG here in New York.
yeah, so yeah, kind of like that. And now we're in this, a lot of the country, most of the country is in these spot markets that still have utilities in them, so that gets a little confusing. But it's basically like one big auction house where electricity is reconciled between buyers and sellers at like 5 minutes ahead, hour ahead, day ahead, week ahead, and then they have like seasonal capacity markets, some of these things. So what I can say is that perhaps one of the reasons why we've seen a little bit more industrial investment in parts of the South is because they're still beholden to these utilities that have big old power plants that can supply a certain level of base load relatively cheaply. Whereas if you go to some of the states or the regions that have these very complex power markets, it tends to be a lot of natural gas and a lot of renewables on the grid because they add more volatility. Traders like that. The way the grid is structured likes that there. And that can be a little less reliable, or very vulnerable to price swings in the gas market, which we saw in like aluminum smelting last year. There were a lot of Northern American aluminum smelters that actually had to suspend operations for a while because the price of natural gas got so high because they were paying for it twice. Basically, the gas they needed to perform the process, and then the gas for the electricity that they needed to couple with that.
Yeah, the that's interesting. In my youth, I did a lot of traveling. In 2008, I decided for whatever reason to hitchhike around Iceland.
Hmm.
And on the east coast of Iceland, there's an aluminum smelter. I can't remember who built it. I think it was Alcan. And like, there's nothing there. It's just this weird valley. And they dammed off a lake that's fed by a glacier, built a hydroelectric project to do nothing but feed this aluminum
Mm-hmm.
smelter, and all the bauxite and other minerals and alumina whatever got boated in from Brazil and Canada and here and there all over the place, and they were basically using this cheap electricity in Iceland. I mean, there was nothing else there except cheap electricity, but I guess aluminum manufacturing aluminum is so energy intensive, it made sense
Mm-hmm.
to build this aluminum plant in ice on the east coast of Iceland where like nobody lives, right?
Yeah, that sounds like a great spot for it. I mean, that's sort of, that's why they used to call hydropower in the late 19th, early 20th century white coal, because it was just as reliable as a coal plant is. In fact, maybe even more so, and is bountiful. So, Niagara Falls, all that stuff. There are a lot of industrial projects put along these areas wherever these things popped up because it was like, I mean, it was like incredibly cheap, highly reliable power.
Yeah, I grew up pretty close to Niagara Falls on the Canadian side of the border. And there's the two hydro plants there. There's the one on the Canadian side at Queenston and one on the American side at Lewiston. Maybe you know the history of those plants. I think the one in Lewiston on the American side was built purposely to help power the Bethlehem steel mill in Lackawanna, just south of Buffalo. Is that true?
I know that there were a lot when they were looking at building it, they were looking for a lot of industrial buyers for the power. And I wouldn't be surprised if Bethlehem was one of them that ponied up. There are also big chemical companies that showed up. I think Dow has a plant near there or something, or at least did. I mean, I haven't checked. Or maybe I'm thinking of DuPont. It's maybe both did. But yeah, they were like, okay, there's frankly just wasn't enough residential demand to justify building a huge power plant. And so they coordinated with major industries to be like, if we're going to basically park capital into building this big ass thing, you guys need to cite your stuff by it and we'll both benefit. And that's how that went down.
Right, yeah. And if anybody that's crossed the border at the Queenston Lewiston Bridge and then got on Interstate 190 and driven towards Niagara Falls, you drive right in front of the face of this massive hydro power plant, and they divert water from the Niagara River upstream where it enters from Lake Erie and then goes through these underground tunnels and then like basically falls down the escarpment and drives these hydro generators underground on both sides of the river. It's actually really neat to look at. So Emmett, tell us what is it that like made you an electrical grid and energy fetishist enthusiast, enjoyer, as the kids say? Like, what brought you here? How did you get here? I mean, you've done so much stuff. You apparently have a pedigree in philosophy. Your background's really interesting. Like, what's the line between young Emmett and now being this electrical guru?
Yeah, I don't know. I was actually thinking about that yesterday while I was sort of like reorganizing some of my books because, I have a lot of books from previous iterations of my life, and so really, when I was in college, I basically studied poetry. Like that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a poet. Like that was my, believe it or not, like that's what, and I have, by the way, I have two liberal arts degrees. So I have one where I went to undergrad at Bennington College, and then another where I got my master's and studied mostly like the Western canon of philosophy at St. John's College in Santa Fe, which is the sister campus to the Annapolis original St. John's College. Um, and I think I've always been curious. So that's basically the only through line that I could come up with is that I've always looked for powerful explanations. And so as I leave college, sort of become Marx pilled like after that, so I'm already like starting to try to think of the world like a little bit more in like material terms, and like how that works. The reason I decided to get a philosophy master's, if we can call it that, was basically for me to figure out like, I was like, well, I can read Marx, but I don't fully appreciate the context he's operating in. So it's sort of like I need to have more of the Western canon under my belt. And then I left grad school and was just trying to write. I'd written poems for so long. And then I remember writing a book review for Paste Magazine and getting a check in the mail. And I was like, I'm never going to write a poem again. I was like, I just got paid to write. This is the coolest feeling in the world. It wasn't very much, but like, this is what I want to do. So I'm going to try to write like political commentary, essays, and stuff like that. And I think I was basically doing what a lot of people who were frustrated, young, overeducated people were doing in America, which is like listening to Chapo and liking Bernie Sanders and being very mad about how like the boomers behaved and the financial crisis went down. Like that, like I wasn't doing anything more original than that, like I think but what made it hard is that I was always living in like some sort of like second or third or fourth city, and you kind of need to be in like urban cores to really like make that type of career work. But I did write one essay for Paste that did really well in 2017, and it was called Lecture Porn, the Vulgar Art of Liberal Narcissism.
I read that. I read that a couple of years ago. I remember that piece.
Yeah.
It was excellent.
Yeah. Thank
That's a
you.
very
Yeah.
that's the rookie hitting the home run on his first at bat.
Yeah, yeah, it's funny too because I got real confident after that. I was just like, oh, I got. Then the next step essay I wrote for them was like shit, and I knew it was shit, and I was like, oh man. But I wrote that, and then I got a DM on Twitter from this guy, Michael Schellenberger, who at the time,
Of the
though he's
Twitter
doing,
files
yeah,
and
he's
of
doing
running for the governor of California.
twice. Yeah, he did that twice. So I had no idea who he was, and he was running an organization at the time called Environmental Progress. And he was like, "What are you doing right now?" And the real answer was I was working the cash register at a bookstore and stealing time from my boss by dicking around on Twitter because it was a slow day. And I said, but what I told him was nothing. And he said, "Great, can I call you?" And the problem is that I was so broke that I didn't even have a phone at the time. And so I had to give him the bookstore's number. And then I made the shipping guy switch with me. And I pretended to take an order from Penguin Random House while I talked to him on the phone for like an hour. So every time my boss would walk by, I'd write down like Moby Dick, like 5 copies or whatever. Like, and he was just like, "What are you interested in?" Blah, blah, blah. I can't even remember what I said. And he was like, I told him, and I kind of probably over explained myself. And he said, "I don't care about any of that. What do you think about nuclear energy?" And I just said that it's bad.
Ooh.
And he was like, "You're wrong." He was like, "And I think I can convince you. You should read this book by the socialist Lee Phillips, his book Austerity, Ecology, and the Collapse-Born Addicts." And he was like, "And watch my TED Talk, and then come out to our headquarters. I might have work for you." And I was like, "Okay." So I read Lee's book, I watched his thing, and I was like, "Oh, nuclear isn't that bad." And then I flew to Berkeley right after the 2017 DSA convention where I was a delegate.
Oh wow.
And yeah, and I'd been nuke pilled by the book and all that.
Can you
And
can you
I,
can you say the name of that book again, please?
yeah, just if you look up Austerity Ecology
Yep.
by Lee Phillips, also a fellow Canuck, you'll find it. Lee has since become a good friend of mine. And anyway, so he sits me, so I meet all of these people. They do an incredible job of like further nuke pilling me. And then I end up just working at the bookstore for a few more years. Michael and I maintain a friendship. For whatever reason, he can't hire me, and that's fine. I was happy with the experience. And I had this like new cool guy to talk to about stuff that I knew nothing about. And then a few years later, he hired me when he went to write Apocalypse Never, and which was his major book against climate alarmism. And then I worked on San Francisco, his second book. And then after that, I'd been so nuke pilled. He was kind of like, "Well, what do you want to do next?" And I was like, "Well, I want to work on nuclear." And he was like, "Great, God bless, go ahead." And so I launched Nuclear Barbarians. And then as I started to get more and more into nuclear, I started to realize that the electricity system was this part of it we just like never really talked about, that it was hard to learn about, that its history, except for the early days, which are exciting with like Thomas Edison to the New Deal, basically, there are a million books about that, but there's like almost nothing about comparatively about what happens after that. Uh, I just started to get really, really into it because the explanations were powerful. Like you could see the making of the modern world through the history of the utility industry, right? So Henry Ford works at a utility under the aegis of one of Thomas Edison's proteges, Samuel Insull. Samuel Insull, before Ford had ever talked about it, was giving lectures on the idea of mass consumption because Samuel Insull realized that Europeans charged a lot for their electricity to sell it to a few people. And he was like, "I'm American. I don't want to do that. I want to sell cheap electricity to everyone I can sell it to. And that's what we're going to do." And so they were constantly balancing these flow states. Like I personally think, I'm convinced that the flow of the assembly line at River Rouge was wired into Henry Ford's brain by his experience working in an electric utility, which deals in constant flow all the time, right? So this made the modern world. There are huge political fights over what we put on the grid, and there have been since the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I was like, oh my God, there's like this whole other story of the American 20th century that gets played out in this essential infrastructure. So that's the really long explanation for how I ended up being a guy who's super interested in energy.
Right. So it sounds almost like a religious conversion, like a road to Damascus. You're wandering the wilderness, and then like you get struck by the nuclear thunderbolt, care of Mr. Schellenberger, and
Hmm.
there's nobody more pious than the recently converted, which you've proven with like your vociferous defense of this stuff. So what is it about? So like this book you mentioned, the austerity thing, the whole cultural zeitgeist around energy, climate alarmism, all these fossil fuels are bad, we're all gonna die. The sort of like, you know for lack of a better way of explaining it, the communist socialist aesthetic of austerity. Oh, we consume too much and we're destroying the environment. There's just
Hmm.
all this stuff like mixes, but at the same
Hmm.
time, as you say, everything we have technologically and society and across society would not exist without electricity. And
Hmm.
we have this electrical grid that's now being relied on to basically power reshoring, power electric vehicles, power everything. But then there's like a fight over what is the source of that power, who controls it, how do we fix it, how do we build it out. Like the whole thing is actually a quite interesting drama of sorts.
Sure. Yeah.
And here you are, having been recently converted to being a proponent for one of the major potential sources of making the whole thing move, right?
Hmm.
So can you give us the like the sell on why is it that nuclear is good, given that throughout recent history nuclear has been demonized by certain parts of the environmental movement in the past? There have been some notable problems, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. um, People have a very the Blinky the three-eyed fish from the Simpsons.
Yeah,
um
totally.
and the whole like, people think nuclear waste is this big deal, but since reading some of your stuff, I've come to discover that the amount of nuclear waste in the world would fit into a football field or something. Like there's not that much of it.
Yeah.
So like,
Yeah.
what sell everybody in the Reader's Digest version of why nuclear is good.
Sure. Okay. So I think we should go to like just grid basics, right? You have a power grid. So what is the hierarchy of needs for the power grid? And reliability is key. You want things that will run close to 100% of the time. Why do you want that? Because people use power all of the time. And intermittent power, power that cuts out, causes lots of problems system wide. That's why we try to avoid blackouts as much as possible. So reliable is key. And then the second thing you want is you want it to be cheap. In other words, you want the inputs that go into that system to not pass high costs down to the consumer, because that has an inflationary effect system wide, right? Uh, so the third thing that you want, right, is you want it to be clean, right? As clean as you can get it. Now, the first two things are the most important. Clean as a tree, right? That's why, like, people don't build coal plants in the
Clean? No, no,
developing
no, no,
world.
no, 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 no. Clean is a treat to you. Clean is a holy sacrament
Yeah,
to many people today.
totally, totally. So if I'm going to pill you my way, I'm going to say, look, if like the reason that developing countries build coal plants isn't because the coal lobby is evil or because they have evil businessmen trying to build stuff. It's because it adheres to the first two criteria, which are really important for building wealth and stability, right? Having dirty electricity is better by more than a country mile than having no or little electricity, right? That is key. That's what the big fights in South Africa are right now. By the way, you can sort of like watch what happens when a grid starts to fall apart and what people start talking about by reading the South African news about their coal plants and their rolling blackouts, right? And most people that live there would much rather have the dirty coal plants and cheap, reliable electricity than to adhere to environmentalist dogma and not. Now, how do we cut the Gordian knot, right? How do we get all three of these things at once? We're going to want something that can work almost 100% of the time. In other words, has a high capacity factor. Nuclear's capacity factor in the United States is over 90%, which is crazy. It runs almost 100% of the time. By comparison, solar's is 25 at most.
Wow,
So,
that's a
yeah,
65% difference.
yeah. So, and the other thing is like you can't tell the sun to shine and you can't tell the wind to blow. You can tell a power plant to switch online. So, the other thing you want, so we've got reliable, we want cheap. People talk all the time about how nuclear power plants are expensive to build. They're 100% right. There is a whole history of how radiation level regulation has basically totally screwed the industry. And there's some, it's hard to build big engineering projects in the decadent West. That is not a uniquely American problem, but that is a serious problem. And I think people should bring it up when we talk about it. They point to like the Vogtle power plant, which is a nuclear power plant that has just been finished in Georgia and has gone something like 15 billion over budget, years over budget. But what I can tell you is that it will pay for itself in a few years because uranium is so dense that you can get a ton of power out of it without very much of it. So, in other words, it is an expensive capital investment that gives you cheap power. On the flip side, renewables are cheap capital investments that give you expensive electricity because something has to cover them when they're not running. And believe me, the things that cover them really love scarcity pricing because it makes them a bunch of money. Nobody likes it when the power switches out. Combined cycle gas operators that can ramp up just in time love wind and solar because it's job security for them.
Right.
Now, the third,
Can I make a point about that just locally?
yeah,
Again,
sure.
upstate New York, and I'm going to talk a little bit of family politics here. So, my brother-in-law, my wife's younger brother, lovely guy. I'm going to send him this podcast. I've sent him some of your writings before. He's a real big renewables dude. That's his stock and trade. He works for an engineering firm here. He's uh he's a Bernie Sanders progressive type. I don't know if he's a climate alarmist, but he's very invested in the climate narrative. Whatever. I'm not going to criticize that. But he's always boosting solar, wind, renewables. Solar, wind, renewables. NICEG is amazing. They're doing all these projects. He works on that stuff. He connects, like he's kind of an engineer. He does building, retro modeling, refits, energy audits. That's what he does for a living. All that's
Mhm.
fine. But the thing is like New York State can get away with that because Niagara Falls and because Quebec and Ontario, where New York State buy an incredible amount of excess hydropower produced on the Hudson Bay, James Bay hydroelectric projects, which
Mhm.
I guess there's a debate about that too, right? With hydro projects, they're renewable, they're clean, but the flooding that goes on upstream of those dams affects nature and the people who may or may not have lived there. Like, there's not a whole lot of folks around up north, but they are there. So, like, do you have an opinion on like where the renewables boosterism intersects with hydropower and all of that?
Yeah, so there are sort of a few ways to think about it. There's a tension deep within the environmental movement about energy in general and even about renewables specifically. They tend to saber rattle for them all of the time, and then at the local level, do everything they possibly can to make sure they won't get built. And that's because wind and solar are incredibly land intensive in the same way that hydro plants can be. I don't know. I'm sure hydro is a little bit more damaging, probably a lot more damaging overall. But that's to say that there is no perfect energy source, right? So it's really about what you want to weigh as your pros and cons, what you think will benefit the system. And then, of course, we have all of these ideological priors that come to the room. Am I against hydropower? Absolutely not. I don't think we're going to see much more of it because we've done about as much as we can in this country. It is completely site based. Now, am I enthusiastic about African nations doing big hydro projects? You bet your ass. Good for them. They deserve a higher standard of living and they deserve to build it on their own terms. It is not for me to decide what their energy profiles should look like. I wish them the best. I really do. So that's sort of my stance on that. Um, and again, it's all about who's weighing these pros and cons and whether or not they're ideologically coherent and whether or not they're highly funded and highly motivated to get what they want done on the
Right.
electricity grid.
So back to nuclear. So uranium is very energy dense. As you
Mm-hmm.
said, it's very expensive to build. I spent a lot of time ideologically in libertarian world, and
Mm-hmm.
due to being at the receiving end of lots of government interference in my own life because of the trucking business. That's another discussion about how regulation was transferred from the business side of it to the drivers over the last 40 years. But like, what could be done to cut through the layers of bureaucracy, red tape, so to speak, um, just the complexes that develop around the building of a nuclear power plant, the interactions with the grid operators, with the utility monopolies. I mean, I understand there's a lot of players here, but like from your perspective, what could be done to reduce that cost, if anything?
Yeah, so I think plenty could. I think the Breakthrough Institute is already working on this. Um, so if anybody wants to deep dive how to deregulate nuclear, they're the ones championing it right now. People get a little bit anxious when you say, well, we want to deregulate nuclear. I think people need to understand that the standard that's applied to nuclear plants right now is something called linear no threshold theory. And linear no threshold means that radiation is not safe at any dose. And just to like cut to the chase, if that were true, we would evacuate every single Colorado mountain town immediately because the background levels of radiation at those altitudes is way above the rest of the country.
Is
Or
is is that because of the altitude or because what's in the mountains?
so it could be both, right? So one of the most radioactive places in the country is the DeVargas Skate Park in downtown Santa Fe, New Mexico, because it's at over 7,000 feet and it is built on a slab of granite shot through with uranium.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's just right downtown there. Kids skate there all the time. I used to work 2 blocks from there. So what's it like when you try to build a power project where the regulator can come in at any moment and say, actually, your background levels aren't low enough. Your background levels aren't low enough. Your levels of radiation are too high when it hasn't been demonstrated that low doses can really hurt anybody. And just so you know, the doses in a power plant are basically at background for just walking around outside. There's no waste leaking. Nuclear waste is a solid, so it doesn't leak.
All right, for dummies like me and possibly some of my listeners, what does the term background radiation mean? Where does the radiation come from? How does it compare to the radiation that might come from a nuclear power plant?
Yeah, so I'm going to defer a little bit to anybody that wants to reach out to me, by the way, feel free to DM me. I'll send you my friend Maddie Hilley's op-ed for the New York Times. She recently went viral on Twitter for putting her pregnant tummy against a big nuclear waste cask
Oof.
because it's safe. And by the way, it was one of the waste casks from 3 Mile Island. But they're put inside double reinforced concrete. They crash trains into that shit and it doesn't break. Completely safe. So background radiation, to get more to your question, is just like the ambient radiation of living on a planet that has a sun. Right. So that's it. Or like you said, there could be things within the materials around you that is radioactive. For instance, there are plenty of, to cut to your profession, trucks hauling bananas right now that are more radioactive because of the potassium than walking around a nuclear power plant today.
Why is potassium radioactive?
I'm not a scientist. I just know that the potassium within it is part of what makes it radioactive. You get minor doses of radiation from bananas, just like from flying in a plane, by the way. Like if you take a Geiger counter on a plane, it'll start to peak as long as you're in the air.
Because you're at 36,000 feet and you're closer
Yeah,
to the
you're
sun.
closer to the sun. Yep, absolutely. So that's what background radiation is. And it gets really noisy once you try to measure those levels. So one of the things we need to do is we need to get the regulator a little bit out of the way. We need to be like, we need a realistic standard for what exposure is, because radiation also saves lives, right? You get an X-ray that finds something that might save your life. You get chemo that kills your cancer and saves your life. That's all radioactive, right? So we need to have a more thoughtful way of safety regulating this industry, because we have done it to death. There was a time in the 70s when the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was adding regulations to nuclear for, I think, maybe 2 years at a rate of 1.3 new regulations per day.
Wow.
Imagine trying to get anything done in that environment. You can't.
No.
So that's one of the things that we need to change. And then another thing is, and I'm sure you've talked about this on your podcast, we need to bring up this country's engineering discipline. We need more engineers. We need more people turning wrenches. We need more people doing the type of work that helps us build important projects like this. We need more tradespeople, frankly, probably less people like me and more people that can actually make these things possible. And there are likely educational incentives we can do for that. And I don't know all the labor market stuff around that, so I'm going to plead humility on it. I'm sure you have some listeners that are way more informed on what's happening in some of those trades than I am. And then the other thing is our electricity markets, the way that we've structured them disadvantages what we call base load power plants. So those ones that have the high capacity factor that I was talking about before, at the expense of wind, solar, and natural gas.
Right. So on that note, on the disincentivization, how does that work? What disincentivizes it? Are there middlemen involved? What are the considerations that make it so that base load is expensive and like nobody wants to pay for it? What's going on there?
Yeah, so great question. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, that the spot markets are like 5 minutes, hour, day, week, month, season, ahead. There are tweaks between different markets in different parts of the country. Like Texas has its own thing going. I don't even think they're under the jurisdiction of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It is the Lone Star State. They're doing their own shit, as Texas
Right.
always does.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say that this is 100% true in every single way across the country as a caveat, but the general trend is this. You have highly subsidized wind and solar that can make prices go negative in the spot market. Basically, like, I'll pay you to take this power. And that's because of the performance tax credits that they're given. Now, they're not going to be able to supply everything. So, like I said, what covers the gap? It's going to be anything that can ramp up really fast to meet them. What's that going to be? That's going to be natural gas turbines. Now, let's say you're a baseload power plant and you are built to operate at like 80 plus capacity factor, right? But you're encountering this market where intermittent renewables can suddenly bid negative at any given moment. How hard does it become to figure out how much money you're going to make year after year when you're exposed to that environment?
Yeah, hard to do budgeting when you can't make any predictions on like input, output, and whatnot.
And then eventually you say, I don't want to run this shit anymore. It's not profitable. It's really hard. It's annoying. And I'm not going to do it. I can just build more gas turbines, or I can get tax credits to build wind and solar.
Right. So it sounds like there's like a tension here between the economic incentives to running actual power plants, be they whatever source, versus the economics of getting any money out of the system where it meets how these systems work and interplay with each other.
Yeah, exactly. And that is the real tension. And look, hey, that's not to say that like Monopoly utilities are great and they've always done the right thing. You can just go through the history and find all sorts of corruption cases, sometimes around nuclear power plants as well, right? Like there is always a political economic dimension to the technical operations of this system. There will never be a purely technically managed grid because there can't be. As soon as humans get involved, as
Politics
soon
gets involved.
politics gets involved, and as soon as anybody has to do anything, money gets involved because it has to. It
Right.
has to. There's
Right.
no way around that, right?
Right. So back to the money question, and the cost to build a nuclear plant. Something I saw you speak on in your content output over the years is that aside from the regulatory stuff, the actual nuclear power plants, their design, construction, the actual building of it, running it, maintaining it is different than the nuclear power plants that were built in the 60s, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we're 60 years out from that. What are the upgrades? What, like, can you give us a sense of like how they've evolved and what's better now?
Yeah, totally. So I think one of the things that people bring up is Chernobyl, and that's actually a really great example to sort of base this off of. First of all, Chernobyl was like a boutique Soviet design. We never had anything that looked like one of those plants. But what that plant was missing is what's called a containment dome around the reactor core. So when it exploded, stuff went everywhere. Our plants don't have, they have containment domes. So that basically means that whatever happens in there stays in there, right? And that's really important for safety concerns, right? There have been some other added features, just tons of them after Fukushima. Um, First of all, where Fukushima was sited and how poorly the seawalls were built was a major factor there. But I know that there have been upgrades to hardening the generators on site that keep different parts moving. Basically, the only piece of energy infrastructure that has international collaboration to improve its maintenance is nuclear. After Fukushima, globally, the industry got together. Actually, plant workers from Diablo met with Japanese plant workers, Diablo Canyon power plant in California, to help them improve their safety protocols. Because in the US, the standards are the highest and the best in terms of daily operations. So I would say that those are the things that people generally worry about. Like, if this blows up, will this happen? We have all sorts of things that like disengage or terminate the reactor core before it ever gets there. And then we have on top of that containment domes. And then on top of that, we have infrastructure hardening around it to the point where you can crash a phantom jet into a nuclear power plant and it won't hurt it. And how do we know that? Because we've actually run tests on that.
I think I saw a video about that once, like an F4 Phantom jet on some kind of like rail system
Yeah,
was
they just ran
was
it into the side of
ran
yeah.
it into a wall that was built exactly like the dome around a nuclear plant, and the Phantom jet basically vaporized.
Yeah, and the wall was still there. So I think that those are the things people are worried about on top of they always say, what about the waste? And the important thing about the waste, and you brought this up, is that in America, for the entire run of the civilian nuclear industry, we can fit stacked on top of itself once, every cask of waste in a football field, which is like nothing. Nuclear is the only energy source that takes care of its own energy, right? It's monitored, it's maintenance, and we want to keep it around because there are these things called breeder reactors, and I'm not a nuclear engineer, so don't ask me exactly how this happens. But what it can do is it can reuse spent fuel, so you can close the fuel cycle on nuclear. You can basically take what you've used and refire it, quote unquote, through breeder reactor. The Russians do this. It's not exactly cost competitive yet, but it is an existing technology that I think we're going to see more of in the future because it's such a game changer in terms of abundant, clean electricity.
Right. How many nuclear plants are still operating in the United States right now?
Oh God, that's a good question. I forgot what it was after Indian Point. Let me look.
Dozens or hundreds?
It is 92. We've got
That's
92
that's
nuclear
it.
reactors. That's it. That's what we've got. And that's about like 15 what it is more of our clean power than I think wind and solar, but that might change this year with the amount of wind and solar coming on our grid. So it's been doing that for decades.
Right. And so the next item in the chain is the grid. And
Mhm.
then I want to actually, well, maybe let's move the conversation because I'm a trucker. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you about was there's been a lot of boosterism and marketing out there on electric vehicles, on electrification of like all your appliances in your home and having them being run smart, grid tied, and electric trucks because everyone sees big trucks going everywhere. That's how our society moves. And they almost all of them run on diesel, and they're, the climate alarmist types, they worship the sky. The trucks pollute the sky, therefore they are evil, therefore we must
Mhm.
transition them to electric or some other power source. What do we know about the limitations to trying to electrify millions of trucks and tens of millions of cars?
Yeah, so we know a few things. I think there are some intuitive and non-intuitive problems. So I'm going to start with an intuitive one. Right now, we are replacing reliable electricity with unreliable electricity. So right now, we are destabilizing supply, and yet we have these plans to increase the burden of demand on the system. That is not going to go well, right? That's going to be very, very hard on the grid. In fact, I know I just read an interview, I think, or an article in the Wall Street Journal where a guy from one of the Southern California utilities says that he knows that there are some EV truck fleets that are using diesel generators to charge their trucks because the grid can't handle the amount of demand that the fleets are putting on the system right now. Pacific Gas and Electric, sort of the most infamous and I think the largest utility in California, has specifically told some people that they just won't be able to charge their fleets during peak hours in the summer, right? Like they just can't handle that. Okay, so that's one. That's the most intuitive. It's sort of like the supply and demand. Do we have enough juice to do this? Not really. We need way more power to be able to do it because adding that burden is really hard. And then the second one is stuff that I think truckers will get. People like you, Gord, and I'm sure you have a lot of truckers in your listenership. But what's great about diesel is that you can take it with you. Like that's why we use it. It's energy dense and you can transport it while you use it.
Yeah, it's
It's
very
hard to beat
portable. You
that.
can you can you can push it along pipelines or put it on trains or carry it around in a tank behind you. Uh, the,
Yeah,
the fossil fuels are very convenient. We already have a distribution set up for it, and one of the challenges of electrifying the truck fleet in America is that a lot of trucking is regional, but some of it goes across the continent, right? So, like, take California, for example. A lot of produce is grown in California and Arizona and then shipped all
hmm
across the country and into Canada, and or comes from Mexico, gets transloaded at the border, again, across the country. And, the latest electric trucks on offer by, Tesla, 500 miles tops. Okay, cool. So now you're 500 miles away from where you charged. You have to pull over and stop and charge again. Does that location out in the middle of nowhere have the charging station capacity for
exactly.
dozens, if not hundreds, of trucks to show up at night and all charge at once? Who's supplying with the electricity? How is it being transported there? Is the electrical generation local to all these truck stops? Like, this is a massive, massive engineering and logistics project that's not just going to happen at the snap of a finger. And
No,
you know, I want to get people like yourself that know more about the limitations of this to like bring us a reality check on that. Like how many kilowatt hours to transport 80,000 pounds for X number of miles, like all the calculations on this stuff, and add into it market fluctuations, where trucks go. Some trucking companies run irregular routes and they kind of go anywhere and could be anywhere at any given time. are those trucks going to be able to like get electricity if they're not on a main route like say Interstate 80 or Interstate 10? Because I remember there was this company called Nikola that was talking about like natural gas over electricity, kind of like a diesel
Hmm.
locomotive type thing. And they were going to have this like vertically integrated natural gas fill up stations, but like they were along all the interstates. But like, what if you're an operator in between the interstates, or you're running regionally, or you're not,
Right.
like trucks are everywhere. Like every little town has got contractors running dump trucks to do sewer and drain work or haul garbage or run snowplows. Like diesel, you can't not just replace diesel tomorrow. Like it's not
No,
happening.
you can't. You can't. I think, by the way, I think, I'm going to hype people that do really good work on these types of issues. People should check out Robert Bryce's work. He's like a mentor of mine, author of many books, runs the Power Hungry podcast, and he also has a Substack where he does a lot of number crunching on stuff like this. And I think that he's far and away one of the best. But one of the things that he and I have talked about is like, yeah, so you have to transmit this electricity out there, right? Like it is essential to how this is going to work. Well, it's a bear to build transmission infrastructure in this country, right? Like it is super difficult, environmental law, but also like, is the utility, whoever owns it, going to make money off of it? It's a big capital investment. How can you guarantee that this new thing we're committing to, EVs, are going to be there tomorrow after they've sunk in all the money for this hopefully permanent piece of infrastructure? You can't, you know. And look, I'm not categorically like against EVs. I think most of them suck. What's that line from Sin City? Like modern cars, they all look like electric shavers. Like I really think that like EVs suffer from that problem. But if people want to drive them, that's fine. But we're not really thinking about the consequences for the system. A piece I read from the Institute of Electrical Engineers pointed out that electric transformers, which are part of the transmission system, will burn out faster by adding all of this demand onto the grid. Well, Robert Bryce just published a piece about how we have a shortage of transformers in this country. So we can't even get the ones to replace and keep going the stuff that we have. It's very, very difficult. The lead times are huge. The utilities, especially the co-ops, are struggling to get those things done. We don't have enough linemen in this country. We need way more of those. Like, who's going to build this? Who's going to take care of it? Like anytime someone brings you a big dream like this, you say, who's going to take responsibility for that?
Who's doing the work? Who's doing the work,
Exactly.
as our friend Oliver Bateman would say it?
Yeah, who's
Yeah,
doing the work? And
who's
that's the
doing the
most
work?
important question you can ask. And people can turn that around on me and say, well, who's going to do the work of the nuclear power plants? And I'm like, that's a really actually difficult question to ask. I love nuclear. I love existing nuclear. We know what happens when it closes. In New York, Indian Point closed, and now you guys are burning way more gas in order to keep the grid running. And that small town that had its tax base from all those plant workers is going to be dead as soon as decommissioning's over. We know what that cost is. But to build new ones, that's a whole other ballgame. And people are absolutely right to want to ask hard questions about that. I'm not giving easy answers. I'm not saying we fix this in one weird trick. What I am saying is everybody needs to eat a huge piece of humble pie and get real about how difficult building new infrastructure is, let alone managing what we already have.
Right. And what do you say to the people about battery storage? The whole battery part of this for storing renewables, storing what you can get off of the existing grid, say the solar panels above your house, whatever. So there's a question about batteries. And I used to follow this guy on Twitter named John Lee Pettimore, who is this like mining specialist guy. He spent his whole
Yes. Yeah,
life in
yeah, yeah.
mining. And he
Sharp
did,
guy.
yeah, he did one of these threads about copper that went
Mm-hmm.
super viral, like millions of views, hundreds of thousands of shares. Like it went crazy. And he basically outlined that there's a shortage of copper in the world. Certain types of power generation require virgin copper. You can't just
Mm-hmm.
like strip all the wires out of a house and go and recycle it and make copper for this stuff, because it has to be the brand new stuff for whatever reason. And one of the points that he banged on about in all of his various threads about all the different minerals, all the different mining operations was there is a cost to producing the minerals and producing the other materials you need to make all of this electrical infrastructure that is super heavily reliant on fossil fuels to get it in the first place. And we cannot
Yeah.
ignore that.
Yeah, no, so that's totally true. So let me take the battery question first. And then we can sort of like talk maybe a little bit about supply chain. So when we're considering the battery question, I try to analogize it to this, right? We've already talked about how like the power system needs to be balanced at all times, right? Like supply needs to be balanced with demand instantaneously, like at the level of microseconds. That's how the grid operates. And electricity is notoriously hard to store. Batteries are meant to solve that problem. And you're supposed to say, hey, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a battery pack next to my solar plant. And when there's too much solar on the grid and nobody wants it, then I'm going to use that cheap power to put into my battery. And then I can use that battery to firm up the grid when it's needed, right? Sounds simple enough. The thing about renewables and the things about adding batteries to that is that, first of all, you've added now a topographical dimension to managing electricity. But which I mean, now you have to deal with where things are happening, not just when things are happening, right? So where is that solar plant? What transmission is it hooked up to? Where is it linked on the grid when it's happening? Right. So now you have added a lot of complexity to an already complex problem. Is that insurmountable? No. But it is something we should consider at scale, right? Do we want to overcomplicate a necessary system? The other issue is that storing something isn't the same as generating something, right? I think about it this way. Like it's sort of like saying, I'm going to slowly replace cornfields with canned corn. Well, eventually you're going to run out of the corn to put in the cans, you know? Like that's a really rough analogy, but I think it sort of conceptually gets to the heart of the issue. Storage isn't generation, right? So when we have these intermittent resources like wind or solar, and they're supposed to be putting power into these batteries, what we are counting on is that we will have everything perfectly synchronized at all times to take advantage of all of this stuff whenever we need it, rather than just building power plants that operate most of the time.
Okay.
So I would say highly inefficient, really difficult to work at scale. I don't really care if people want domestic solar panels on the roof with battery packs or whatever. That's their property and that's their own business, you know. But like when we're looking at the utility scale, it's not going to work the way that advocates say it's going to work. I'm not against battery technology per se. You do need some level of storage. Batteries are helpful for storing power. That is a useful thing to have on the grid to handle scarcity moments. But past a certain point of penetration, it's just not going to do what a power plant does because it's not its job to do what a power plant does.
Right. And on the mining question and the sourcing of all the required materials, do you have a particular take on that?
Yeah, so my take on that is that this is again from my buddy Robert Bryce, and he says, the lower your energy density, the higher your resource intensity. So to break that down, uranium, super energy dense. So you don't need a lot of extraneous resources to take advantage of its energy density. It's all right there in the structure of uranium. You take something that's dilute, like wind and solar, suddenly you need a lot of different resources. You need a lot of land to get all of that.
To
You need a
capture
lot
it.
of copper, yeah, to get all of that. You need a lot of rare earth minerals to get all of that. And what does all of that require? That requires tons of mining and integrated supply chains. Now, again, all power sources are going to use a little bit of that. There's no, we don't live in heaven. There are trade-offs for everything. But John Lee Pettimore is absolutely right when he points out that the copper demands, the lithium demands, like all of these things are going to be very, very hard on our supply chains and on the earth to get power from resources that don't work all the time and often need to be either taken apart or repowered within 10 to 20 years.
What do you mean by taken apart or repowered?
So solar plants don't last forever, right? So right now they last for about like 20 years.
So like
And
so a basic rectangular solar panel, which is made out of some kind of glass wafer with
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm a dumbass. Like I said, I drive truck for a living. I don't know what they're made out of. But like I thought solar panels were sort of built to last, and the only way to break it was like throw rocks at it or something.
I mean, you absolutely can break it that way. And look, hey, 20 years is nothing to sniff at, right? It's longer than 1 year. Like 20 years is a long time for an industrial project to work. To put that in comparison, we think nuclear might last for 100 years. Certainly, we're getting close to 80, right? So think
A
about,
nuclear power plant built in 2023 will last until 2103.
and perhaps longer. Yes. We
Wow.
don't know. Yeah, right. So think about how long these things are going to exist. But yeah, they degrade. And as they degrade over time, they become more inefficient. My buddy Isaac Orr, who works at Center of the American Experiment, he deals a lot with Minnesota power politics. And one of the things that he noticed is that the wind turbines out there get repowered way before they say that they're supposed to, right? So they're supposed to last maybe like 15 years. Oftentimes it's like 9, 11 years. They need to start repairing things in the gearbox. Everything wears out. But the problem is like how, okay, let's take this to the next level of thinking. So we're not just doing all of this once, right? We're doing it over and over again, 20 years at a time, right? Do we think that's a wise allocation of our resources? Do we think it's worth it at a grand scale? My vote is no, I don't.
Right. So I'm going to bring this back to trucking. And I know that's not your
Please
purview
do.
and you might
Yeah.
not know about it. So I talked to this guy named Chase Barber, and he's trying to build these like diesel electric hybrid trucks out in BC, and good for him. I think his project is very interesting and it might produce some fruit. One of the things that he and I discussed was the most environmentally friendly piece of anything you have, car, plant, infrastructure, is the one that already exists, right? Because there's a carbon footprint to everything we build if we're going to speak in terms of climate
Yeah.
stuff, right? So when like the whole building to last thing is seem I don't know, maybe I missed it, but it seems people are forgetting that. And the government is doing everything it can to basically wipe out the people that are trying to do the build to last thing with trucks. A Caterpillar C15 or a 3406 E block will basically last forever if you maintain it, right? So every million and change miles, you might have to do an in-frame, new sleeves, new
Mm-hmm.
bearings, whatever, but then you put it all back together and you're going to get another million miles out of it, right? And if the guy
Mm-hmm.
driving it is trained properly, depending on the loads, what it's doing, it's going to get X fuel mileage, but that piece of plant already exists. That C15 block will be here as long as you keep building replacement parts for it forever.
Mm-hmm.
What's the problem here, right? So what ends up happening is as the we just saw this weird law in California where they basically said no more trucks on the road in California built after I think it was 2010 or 2011 because
Yeah.
California is way ahead on like emissions regulations and
All that stuff.
yeah. So the first interference with truck motors came in the mid 2000s. I think it was around '07, and then there was the second version of that was 2010. And California has basically said no trucks in California before the 2010 one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. But the problem is like okay, great. So we're gonna keep buying new trucks. Eventually, they get miled out, and like there are people who think long term and will spend the money on maintaining an older rig, but there's a lot of big companies that don't. So they just keep turning them over. what's the carbon footprint? What's the energy demand? What's the resource demand to just keep
Yeah.
building new trucks all the time, right? So California is basically punishing anybody who might be a sole owner operator, maybe a farmer that's got 5 or 6 trucks, other pieces of equipment on his farm, that's got perfectly serviceable equipment that does not require the carbon footprint to build a new piece of equipment. As long as that guy's maintaining it, why not just let him keep using it, right? And if the rest of the market, now this is getting into like uh the free rider stuff, right?
Sure. Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
maybe maybe in the world of carbon discussions and emissions, the guys with the old equipment, small in number as they are the free riders. However, if you factor in that they're not contributing to the requirements for new lithium, new copper, new this, new that, yeah, okay, maybe their older trucks aren't getting the best fuel mileage in the world, but we're still making diesel. Their vehicles still work. Let them use it. Why keep punishing these people who have a piece of plant, a piece of equipment that still works, is still functional, just because it defies current thing, right? Like
Yeah.
from like
I agree.
a zoomed out bigger picture thing, like
Yeah.
why do that? And like, what would, do you have a sense of like what is the impetus behind the state of California to punish anybody with an older truck? Illinois is thinking about doing the same thing. Illinois is looking at what California did and saying, right, we're just not going to let anybody in the state with a truck older than X model year. Well, okay, cool. So you're just punishing anybody that kept around an older piece of equipment and did not contribute to the carbon required to build a new one. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, so we've got a lot of like bizarre thinking like that. So I think that there are a few reasons for this. I mean, one, you know, it is really difficult to get a handle on these systems. It is really hard. I don't fault anybody for not knowing how they work, but I do think it's a problem when people who don't seem to ask these second and third order questions start passing laws that impact the second and third order problems. So that's a whole other issue. I think the part of it we can say is like, okay, maybe we're seeing some industry handouts here. Who's going to benefit from this? What's their relationship to the government? Whatever. Another part of it is that this ideology of fear around the climate has its grip on people's throat. They seriously do think that the world is going to end if we don't do something about this. And they know, or they at least say, that it's a global problem, but there is no yet global government that's just going to enforce all of these policies. So what do? They
yeah,
try
yeah.
to, yeah, they try to get them passed where and when they can, right? So there's these state levels, and then there's this whole like the memetics of politics, like California being like, we're going to be the most aggressive on this, or whatever, because they want to look a certain way to everybody else. And then the other states that are similarly inclined will riff off of their playbook. So there's all of this stuff in the mix here on top of that. But you're absolutely right in saying that what we're losing sight of is basic everyday people that do the work that keeps our society running. And I think, a major problem that we have here is the distance between the people who are terrified of climate change and highly motivated to get these policies passed, or who are terrified of their constituents who are terrified of climate change and so highly motivated to get these laws passed, and the people who make our world work. And that's really tragic to me. I think the downstream consequences from this are really, really rough. And I think we can see that playing out in California. It's not going to go well for them, these decisions. Eventually, a bill is going to come due. And in fact, already has. Like yesterday, California had like a totally normal day weather wise. And they had to send out an alert that they were having a power shortage. This was this week, like within the last like 3 or 4 days. They're just having a mild summer day. And they were just like, oh, we need to send out an alert. We don't know if we have enough. And that's
Wow.
not a good sign. Like California is, I mean, I've lived there. It is very temperate. It is about as temperate as you can possibly get as a place to live. That's why so many people want to move there. And it's already running into those issues. So what's it going to be when we have all these EVs on top of this, when we have the industrial demand on all of this? And then there's the geopolitical aspect of this. We don't, America doesn't have the supply chain on lock. China does. Now, have we made some inroads to sort of peeling that back a little bit? We sure have, but not enough. And we've basically made it illegal to mine for resources in this country. It is just too hard. Everybody keeps demanding that we need all of this lithium and we need it from America so that we can do this energy transition, so we can put it in these EV batteries or whatever we're doing. And yet, every time anybody wants to explore anywhere on American soil for where we can mine that lithium, who shows up? A bunch of environmental groups who are demanding that we fight climate change with renewables to stop that mining from happening. So these things are going to become increasingly tense over time. The fights will become fraught. I think anybody who pays attention to like what's going on in the environmental left will see that there is a major divide from the people that are like, fuck it, we ball. Like, we're not going to get better than the Inflation Reduction Act to fund all of these projects. So we need to deregulate shit now and we can build stuff. And then the older legacy organizations that still have this conservationist instinct that will be hostile to this every step of the way because their path dependency is just to tie up every major industry in court over environmental issues.
That's their stock and trade and how they make themselves relevant and keep fundraising.
Oh, it's how they've done it for, I mean, the NRDC was founded, the Natural Resources Defense Council was founded in the 70s. And one of the first things it did was go after a New York utility that was trying to build the Storm King battery pump storage plant in upstate New York. And that was one of their first major fights, in the same way that the Environmental Defense Fund split off from the Sierra Club, because for a while the Sierra Club was pro-nuclear, around the same time to fight the San Onofre nuclear power plant in California. They actually said that they would prefer a coal plant. And then when the utility gave in and said, fine, we'll build a coal plant, they're like, yeah, actually, we don't want that either.
Oh wow. Wow. Yeah, that's a hard it's just interesting that all these fights here. So bear with me for a second. So there's this
Sure.
there's this tension with, okay, we want to transition, but we don't want to supply the required materials ourselves because that creates an environmental hazard here. But it's okay if we do it in other countries where, if I might be so bold and generalizing, the left also fetishizes people of color and foreigners. And another interesting thing is that, like, there's this demand that America like just receive migrants from everywhere, and the same in Canada. Justin Trudeau's official policy is to immigrate 500,000 people a year to Canada. In 2022, over a million people immigrated to Canada legally and illegally. And where's the infrastructure coming to house, provide healthcare, jobs, all of this
Mm.
stuff? So over and above the grid considerations, over and above the power demand, over and above all these plans, we are now just bringing everybody here. Come on in. The Democrats don't care about how many people show up here from Central America or Africa or wherever. Trudeau
Mm-hmm.
doesn't in Canada. And I'm not trying to say this as like being some xenophobe or total zero immigration, but like there's a material reality we have to deal with. And how do we provide services for all these people? And then how do we provide services for the people who already live here? And nobody seems to have a plan for that. It's just, hey, migrants, welcome. If you ask questions about it, you're a racist. Case closed. Like,
Mm-hmm.
how
Well,
do
I
we
think we
get how do we
see,
how do we get past that, especially where it concerns it meets this environmental and material equation?
yeah. So I wonder, how people over there think about these types of things. I mean, so first of all, some of these environmental organizations have a very cozy relationship with the Chinese government. And that's just a fact. They send envoys over there. They like, right? That's where most solar panels are built. That's where most of the supply chain is. It's under there. So I think they're totally fine with that. They don't really care. They don't care if it's domestic manufacturing. Do I think that they love Chinese communism or something like that? No, not necessarily. I think it just serves their own interests as a group, right? Like that's their, it's not necessarily conspiracy, more a confluence of interests. So I think that's something to worry about. I mean, I can't speak to the Canadian situation. I know that, well, first of all, I'm pro legal immigration, very much so. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. But I think any sovereign country has a right to enforce its borders, and it's democratically up to them how they do that. People could talk to the Mexican government about their southern border if they want to have an interesting conversation that would probably flip some of their assumptions about how people south of the border feel about illegal immigration. All that being said, I'm not necessarily certain that there is a contradiction between the environmental commitment for not building things here and the influx of migrant labor that's coming in, because I think that a lot of those people get soaked up into our low skill surface economy anyway, which is already a lot of what we're doing. And even some of our high skilled stuff, and undercutting unionization. I mean, that's a story as old as time, right? That's why, there have always been fights over that in this country. So I understand that it's a problem. I'm not sure if that intersects with the environmentalists' aims for things that are built abroad by people that aren't us. I'm not necessarily certain that the US is going to have a problem accommodating the labor of the people that come in. And the Canadian situation might be very different. I know that Ontario is anticipating electricity shortfalls, and that's why it has committed to building more nuclear power plants to help meet that forthcoming demand. Some of that, I'm sure, is driven by people emigrating and immigrating into the major urban cores there. So that's the best I can sort of reckon what's happening there.
Right. Yeah. Well, Premier Ford, it's probably the only thing he ever did that I've agreed with thus far. Mind you, I'm expatriated from Ontario, but from what I've seen of Premier Ford, his termination of what the previous Liberal Party government was doing with its greenification schemes and the excess charges it put onto everybody to run them, and how they tried to dance around all that was good, and his commitment to more
Mm-hmm.
nuclear power is good, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
only two good things I have to say about the man or his policies. But I'll leave it at that. But I
Yeah.
mean, like, it's not just about the labor though. Like when you have all these extra people here, and then never mind, natural people, people who have kids here, population growth. But like, there's material provision, right? That's more demand on
Mm-hmm.
power grids. It's more demand for everything, and more demand necessitates more mining, more resources, more power. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I understand on the left, there's also some crazy folks that think like we should just stop reproducing and more people is bad. And I guess kudos to them for being consistent with their other views, but trying to tell people or shame them into not having kids. I mean, good luck with that with other cultures where having
Mm-hmm.
kids is like that's what they do, and that's
Mm-hmm.
tradition, and there's nothing wrong with that at all, and more people here should have more kids. I'm a pro-natalist. More children, please. um
Mm-hmm.
but like I say, I just want to be able to square that with the demands on the material environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're just incoherent. I think that that's really it, right? Like one of the unfortunate things about politics is nobody owes each other's consistency. There's no political referee that comes in and say, "Hey, that's a contradiction." Like if you do that, things might go weird. That just doesn't happen. And so I think the best you can have is institutions that allow for different people to take power, or to have a countervailing impact on those things based on their own perceived self-interest, right? So that's really all we have to sort of square that circle. And I haven't been impressed with the way the environmental left sort of thinks through its own demands at all so far. And I don't think that that's ever really going to change. except for a few people who are friends of mine or smaller organizations like the Breakthrough Institute that are consistent with their own line and are also pro-growth. So yeah, I think this is but yet another venue for the buffet of internal contradictions that seem to be on offer almost everywhere in different political domains, you know?
Right. Okay. So, back to power. So in your mind, to let's go to electric vehicles. If we followed the hype and marketing of the EV boosters of the Elon Musks of the world, and you know Tesla semis and all the rest of this stuff, how much more grid build out are we going to need? How many more nuclear plants are we going to need to actually fulfill these dreams? Like, where do you
Oof.
see the build out? Like, how much more build out do we need to keep up with the promises or anticipation of such?
So that's really all going to depend on what we decide to. Obviously, you'd have like basically a lot. If you were going to model this, let's say, you'd have a lot of different scenarios that you'd look at, like with different types of power mix. Here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say basically like none of it's going to come true the way that these people are going to say that's going to come true. And I'm going to point to a few examples, right? Like we can't get permitting reform fixed in this country. Permitting reform would be essential to build the power lines that will go to renewables, right? To hook them up to the grid because they're built far away from where they're most needed. Okay. So if we can't do that, then we know that the renewables dream is not going to show up. And then if we did, we've already talked about what the problems for the grid will be in terms of destabilizing supply and increasing demand on it. So what I imagine is that we are going to basically watch more and more of our system convert to natural gas. And I think that for a few reasons. One, it's clean enough. Two, we know how to build it. Three, it works well in the spot market. And fourth thing is we have a lot of it. God bless Texas. Um, and the other thing is it's still going to be hard to build. I mean, nobody's going to finance new coal plants. And it's still going to be hard to build nuclear. So I don't have like specific numbers for like what we're going to need because there could be a bunch of different variables that go into that. But what I can say is that the types of things people are promising, I don't think are going to come true. Not even some of the things I want to come true, right? That's also what I'm communicating here, right? There are things I want to happen that I think have too many headwinds right now. Do I think that that can change? Absolutely. I just don't see it in the cards right now. I think more pain is sadly required for us to wake up to these realities. And we already see that luckily happening in certain European countries that have looked at what Germany has done in shutting down its nuclear and trying to replace it with renewables and totally failing. And the shock of energy shortages because of the Ukraine war. They're like, we're not doing that. We're going to build nuclear power plants. So they're ahead of us on the pain and solution scale. And it'll take a little while for us to catch up because the blessing of America is also its curse when it comes to these. We are so resource rich. We can afford to fuck around for way longer than anyone else.
And America and Canada, due to dint of geography, geopolitics, just insulated. We're just insulated and lucky.
Yeah, we're very, very lucky. I think I'm very impressed with the not just Canada deciding to refurbish the Pickering plant, but commit to more nuclear. A lot of that, I have to say, had to do with a dear friend of mine, Dr. Chris Kiefer, up there, who helps run Canadians for Nuclear Energy. And he was a prime mover in getting unions on board and all sorts of groups on board to make those things sort of happen. So, look, I think there are solutions out there. I think that the solutions we're pursuing right now are going to create way more problems. And I think we should be way more prudent than we are about these issues. Because the other thing is like developing world emissions kind of don't matter as long as the developing world just keeps building coal plants everywhere. Right? Like we've done a great job of bringing our emissions down through natural gas and replacing it with coal in America. That's great. Could we do more? Yeah, with nuclear. But unless we start helping developing countries build nuclear power plants, they're just going to build coal because guess what? They want air conditioning just like you and me. They want heating just like you and me. They are normal people who want a better standard of living.
And there's lots of coal deposits still kicking around.
And it's nearby, right? Pakistan learned a painful lesson last year. For all the shit the West talks about fossil fuels or whatever, they were first to price Pakistan out of the global LNG market to make sure that Europe could make it through the year. That's rough. They were immediately like, okay, we need more coal and we need more nuclear because that's nearby. You can store that on site. We are not reliant on an international spot market for that.
Yeah, and on the question of reliance and distributed power sources, I remember I asked you about this once. These sort of small thorium reactors that you can build in a 20-foot shipping container, and that would power
Oh yeah,
a
those,
small to
yeah.
medium-sized city. As I understand it, that's been like a thing that's been promised for generations that's just never
Mm-hmm.
happened, and it's always, as you put it, just over the horizon but never actually shows up.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything more to that at
God,
all?
I haven't taken a look at thorium in a while. I mean, we're also pursuing some fission products, I think, right now that are of similar size and might do the same thing. I have a buddy, Mark Heineman, who's interested in getting like shipping container sized nuclear out in the oil fields of Texas to like decarbonize how we get carbon, which is, I think, a pretty sick idea. But um, but as far as thorium goes, yeah, I mean, sort of the joke with thorium and fusion is that every year we're 20 years away from it. And I don't know, like I think that we should be putting R&D money into figuring some of that stuff out. Like, yeah, totally. You want to be learning from that because you also don't know what industries might come from your research into that. So I think that that's worth spending time on. Would I bet on it? Absolutely not, but that's fine. That's totally fine. Like you discover and learn so much in trying to crack hard problems like that I think the benefit of research far outweighs the cost.
Right. Yeah, and you never know what other gifts are going to come down the road either. I just think the like idea of distributed and available cheap power and less centralization of the control of it, and as you said with the example from Pakistan, less reliance on spot markets, and having some stability to the system is something we should aim for, eh? And especially again with trucking, like if they want to electrify trucks, cool, as long as they make them look good. I'm all about aesthetics. I'm all about aesthetics, and all the new trucks look like shit, and I want nothing to do with them. So if someone makes like an electric truck where we actually have distributed, available, cheap electricity, cool. Just make them look good. I'll sign up. And on that happy note, Emmet, Mr. Penney, thank you for your time. Where can people find you? I know you're everywhere, but give us a list.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Nuke Barbarian. So you can reach out to me there. I try to get to DMs. I don't always do it. So if I don't respond, don't take it personally. And then you can sign up for my newsletter, which is gridbrief.com. It's free. It comes out 5 days a week. It's about 1,000 words a day. And it's basically all the most important stuff about what's happening with energy and electricity around the world. You can find my podcast, Nuclear Barbarians, wherever podcasts are offered. And if you're on my Twitter feed, you will see my work come out in various publications like Compact, American Affairs, American Compass, lots of places with American in the title, frankly. Um,
and,
that's usually who likes to
and
hear what I have to say.
yeah, and some places where I've written a few things too, strangely
That's
enough.
right.
Yeah, I highly recommend your deep dive into the history of the grid that came out in American Affairs a few months back. That was a monster. That was a book in and of itself. And I believe you said you're working on a book.
Yeah, that's basically like the extrapolation of that piece. That piece was sort of like I wrote three pieces for American Affairs. The first one was what happened to nuclear, basically. And I was like, can I do a long research project on my own? That's what I wanted to answer for myself when I wrote that. And then it was yes. And then I was like, okay, can I outline an idea for a book in a research project? And that was the grid piece. And then the third one was, could I write a chapter to a book as an independent article? And then that was my third piece for them, which was on the history of Enron. And the answer to that was yes. So, yes, I am currently putting together a proposal for a history of the American electric grid that will contextualize the problems that we're running into today. So, it's the
Wow.
book that I wish somebody could have handed me when I'd started looking into this as somebody who doesn't have a technical background. In case you can't tell from some of my answers on like how radiation works or whatever. But and who really cares about and is curious about essential pieces of infrastructure like this, which I think will continue to become a news item. COVID sort of reintroduced us to the material world in a pretty brutal way, and I think it'll be a few more years before we're at escape velocity from the commodity sector, if we ever get back to that level of opulence again. And I think we
Right.
will.
Well, I mean, on the book, and like you say, you're not an engineer or a hard scientist, but at the same time, we need people who understand that stuff and be able to communicate it effectively, which you're very good at. And part of the reason I invited you on the show, I think all of your articles have been highly illuminating and entertaining reads. If you're into that kind of nerdery, you'll learn lots of stuff. Everybody go follow Emmett. And, hey, thank you very much for coming on, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me, buddy. Really appreciate it.
All right, way of the road.